This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'm joined by three people who are going to be talking about the origins and the tenets of the religion of Hinduism, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Hinduism, and I have three experts on it that we'll be talking with. On audio, I have Dr. Chandrahar Dwivedi. On the left of the screen, you will see Anne-Marie Barr, and on the right, John Paul. Is it Sidna or Sidna?
Sidna.
Sidna, okay.
Sidna.
Sidna, okay. So, Dr. Chandra, if you could you take a minute or two just to give a little background about yourself and anything that you studied or written about the subject of Hinduism?
My name is Chandrahar Dwivedi. I was born in India, in a holy city of Varanasi. And I was born in a Hindu family. My father, grandfather, great-grandfather, everyone was Hindu priest. Mm-hmm. And so I was raised in a Hindu priest family, but did not really study Hinduism. So my knowledge of Hinduism is just by practice and born in the family.
Okay.
So I have a PhD degree in pharmacology.
Okay.
I was a distinguished professor and department head at South Dakota State University and retired in 2013.
Okay.
And I have a status of distinguished professor emeritus at South Dakota State. But since I came to US in 73, there were not very many Hindu priests around. So just because I was born in the Hindu priest family, I had some knowledge, some understanding. So I started providing the Hindu priest service to the community. And since then, I started and I'm still doing it. So I'm quite actively involved with the Hindu community and provide these services, whatever they need, and study and guide them, whatever I could do.
Okay, well, that's good. I'll use you as my go-to man on the day-to-day aspects of Hinduism, and I'll use Anne-Marie and John Paul to give us sort of a more background historically. Anne-Marie Barr is on the left. She teaches at the same university that Dr. Chandra does. Anne-Marie, if you could give a minute or two a bit of background about yourself and your interest in the religion of Hinduism.
Actually, I'm a emerita professor,
okay.
Retired, and I am now in Vermont.
Okay.
I studied Hinduism as a graduate student, spent a couple of years learning Sanskrit, but when I actually went out into the field to teach, I was one of very few people in a small department. So I spent most of my time and my research time very broadly busy with all of the different religions. So at this point, I have edited a book on Hinduism, but I have not written any texts on Hinduism at this point. But still a very lively interest in religion. I teach it as part of the World Religions course. I'm involved in interfaith dialogue, and that involves Hinduism.
Okay. Well, on the right is John Paul Sidna. He's my third guest. John Paul, if you could give a little background about yourself and your interest in Hinduism.
Yes, my name is John Paul Sidner, and my primary interest in Hinduism is theological. In other words, I study Hindu theology. I'm actually a practicing Christian and what's called a constructive theologian. In other words, I try to do new Christian theology. But I believe that religions can do theology. They can think better if they think in companionship with other religions. Because if you study, you ask yourself new questions you haven't asked before. You can have new conversations people haven't had before, and that can really enrich the theology of your own traditions. So with Hinduism, my specialization is theology of Ramanuja, who's a Sri Vaishnava theologian and founder of the Vishishtadvaita tradition. And I have been richly stimulated as a Christian theologian by studying Ramanuja's theology.
Well, let me.
I'm the author of a book, Ramanuja and Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher is a very prominent Protestant theologian. The title of the book is Ramanuja and Schleiermacher Toward a Constructive Comparative Theology.
Well, let me start off with the basics. Then we'll talk a little bit about the history, and then Hinduism and the modern to end the show. Is Hinduism a polytheistic religion by nature? And if so, does it qualify in the way animist religions might? Or some people could even argue that Christianity, with its triune God, could be considered polytheistic. So let me start with you, John Paul, since you mentioned it. Is it a polytheistic religion?
Well, there are a billion Hindus, and that billion Hindus worship in very different ways. Most of the Hindus I interact with, I would not describe as polytheistic. In particular, the Sri Vaishnavas are very much monotheists, so very much worship Vishnu and Vishnu alone. They believe all the other gods to be administrators for Vishnu, helpers for Vishnu. So I would describe them as more monotheistic than polytheistic. I think you can find some Hindus who will they'll certainly worship different gods at different times for different reasons, but most of them consider those different gods to be an expression of some type of highest, singular, highest, ultimate reality.
How about you, Anne-Marie? What's your take on that?
I was philosophically inclined when I was studying Hinduism, and one of the things that intrigued me about it is that Hindus do not attempt to exclude people because there's a logical contradiction. So it's not a problem if in Hinduism, if some Hindus choose to worship one god, another many, one or none. And I was very taken with this very different philosophy that didn't operate on a strict logical a or not a premise and exclude anything that couldn't be fit into that. And one of the impacts of that has been that Hinduism has been able to accommodate a lot of different ways of thinking and believing in a way that is very enriching, I think, to somebody coming from a more strongly Aristotelian background, I would say, where you exclude that middle.
Dr. Chandra, as someone who was raised in Hinduism, were you raised, do you believe, in a monotheistic or in a more polytheistic manner?
In my opinion, I would say Hinduism is polytheistic.
Yes. Okay.
Because, even there, as John Paul indicated, there are billion people and they worship the God in very different ways. But still, a substantial and very large number of the Hindus believe in teaching of more than one person. So I strongly feel I would see it as a polytheistic.
Well, let me just, yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So even, I'm living in the United States for 45 years. And I have a lot of Christian friends and Muslim friends. So even technically, I'm not Christian, I'm not Muslim, but I believe in what they pray. But still, I think I'm Hindu. So I think it's polytheistic. I could believe in teaching of anyone I like.
Yeah, Dr. Chandra, John Paul described the religion sort of as Vishnu plus a bunch of administrators, sort of the CEO model of religion, I guess you would call it. Do you subscribe to that? That Vishnu?
Right.
No?
No,
That's just one community of Hindus.
Okay.
Sri Vaishnava community. That's not.
Okay.
I can't say anything about all Hindus.
Okay.
But with regard to the Sri Vaishnavas, they really are monotheists in their worship of Vishnu.
Okay. And how about you, Dr. Chandra?
That's very limited definition. Like, the Vaishnavas, they simply do not believe only in Vishnu. They pray all the gods along with the Vishnu, but they are primarily main deity is Vishnu. So I think I disagree with that.
Well, let me turn to Anne-Marie and ask this: is Hinduism like other religions in that it is split into different sects? I mean, there's the Sunnis and the Shias, the two main divisions in Islam. There's Protestants, Catholics, and then Eastern Orthodox, and Lutherans, Episcopalians, Baptists, etc. In Christianity, Jews have a few sects. How many strains of Hinduism are there?
Oh, many, but it's a little different in that there are more lineages. You follow teachers,
Okay.
specific teachers, and their interpretation and understanding of the religion.
When you say teachers, are they considered prophets or just interpreters?
Uh, they are. Hinduism is not is a little different than the biblical religions, the Western biblical religions, in the way it understands revelation, though it does have an understanding of revelation, but it's not audio as much as it is by metaphor of seeing, and they are descendants of the seers. They are people who understand what the seers saw, who wrote the Vedas and saw the Vedas and the other scriptures.
Yeah. Dr. Chandra, you wanted to chime in before we started talking about the history of the religion, so go ahead.
I think, Hinduism is way of life. I think, people, the Sanskrit word for Hinduism is dharma, which is, if you translate it in English, it's not religion, it's the way of life.
Uh-huh.
So once you have a billion people, everybody has a different way of life.
Mm-hmm.
So same way, even in broader umbrella of Hinduism, each one is slightly different from other one. Like, I'm married to my wife for 56 years, but we pray differently.
Mm-hmm.
But we believe in most of the same thing. So my point is, unlike Christianity or Islam, Shia and Sunni and Catholics and Protestants, we do not have a clear-cut distinction. Even I pray slightly differently, but I'm still broader Hindu. But only one part of our religion, Hinduism, our way of life, I could say, which is Arya Samaj. And like most of the time, when people talk about Hindus, they think, Hindus have multiple gods and Shiva and Brahma and Vishnu and Hanuman and, we have so many gods. And each god has a different shape. Some have elephant face, some have, monkey face. But the Arya Samaj, which is a kind of pretty liberal but strict part of the Hinduism, they do not believe in particular shape of the god. They think there's only one god. Mm-hmm. And that god cannot be given a face, and that does not have a name. And that god is, they call Parampita, Parameshwar. Or when you translate in English, it simply means supreme power. And that kind of looks after all the gods and all living beings. So I would say Arya Samaj is the very liberal but strict interpretation of the Hinduism. They do not believe in any of these gods. What we talk about Vishnu and Shiva or Hanuman or any god. Mm-hmm. They just believe there's only one god, and that provides, the nurturing to all living beings.
Well, Dr. Chandra, I want to talk about the history, but from what you just said, it sounds that you or some people that look at Hinduism more as a pantheistic religion, and that there's kind of a divinity within all things, that the gods are, in a sense, subservient to the cosmic force, if you will?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, let me then turn to history, and Anne-Marie or John Paul can pick up on this. This is the 5th or 6th show I've done on some of the major religions, so I want to get into the history, how it developed. Is Hinduism, basically, did it develop in the subcontinent, or was it imported from elsewhere, from Indochina or from Persia or whatnot? Either one. You want to take it, Anne-Marie? Go ahead.
You're going to get two different answers, I think.
Okay.
A practicing Hindu or a Hindu scholar who lives in India, and a Western scholar.
Okay.
But what Western scholars would say is that we begin with the Indus Valley civilization at the earliest about 2,500 BC. With some of, they're still interpreting, of course, the remains of that civilization, but it looks like some of the images are very close to those of Hindu deities. And then we move through the Vedas, which are written documents, and the Upanishads being the last part of that. and then into the literature keeps proliferating into the Puranas and the commentaries and the law books. And it is very much, as Dr. Dwivedi said, an entire way of life. And you can find some Hindu scripture that deals with every aspect of life. And it's very much a complete way of life. And then we can talk about contemporary things happening in the subcontinent, if you like, later on. Most Hindus do still live the vast majority still live in India, 80%. But Hindus around the world.
John Paul, what is your take on the historical underpinnings of the religion, or its start?
Well, you're asking a very loaded question. I'm not sure if you know how loaded it is.
I don't.
But according to some devout Hindus, India and the Vedas and the Sanskrit language, for example, had to arise in South Asia. In other words, in India itself. Now, there are Western scholars who believe that the Vedas and the Sanskrit language came into India around maybe 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. And that is the very heated debate within studies of Hinduism, is the origins of their scriptures, the origins of their sacred language, Sanskrit, and if it has always been in the Indian subcontinent or if it was imported into the Indian subcontinent by Aryan invaders around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago.
Dr. Chandra, you said that you come from a long line of Hindu holy men. What is the inside the view? What is the oral tradition of how Hinduism arose?
I think as Anne-Marie indicated, the Indian scholars, Eastern scholars think the religion or dharma, what the Sanskrit word for the Hinduism, is from that particular place in now modern India, because the scripture writes about the mountains and rivers and valleys. They are all in India. When you talk about Ganges River, holy river, that's in India. When you talk about the holy city, Banaras, Kashi, that's in India. When we talk about the Himalaya mountain, that's written in the Vedic scripture. That's on the north of India. So when you see geographical references in Vedas, they definitely indicate that the religion originated from the place where it is now. That's my belief, and I do not know if any Hindu believes other way around.
Okay. Well, let's talk then about how the religion has changed and grown over the eons. Either John Paul or Anne-Marie, you could take this. We see, I grew up as a Lutheran, so I know a little bit about Martin Luther and the 91 Theses and stuff. Are there similar things that over the 3,000 or 4,000 years, as John Paul described it, that we had swings back and forth? Were there fundamentalist Hindus, and then for 500 years was there more open stuff? Was there ever a split? Were there heretics? The things that we associate with all kinds of Western religions.
Go ahead, John Paul.
Go ahead, John Paul.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
I would describe the evolution of Hinduism. I would describe Hindu's greatest power as its assimilated power. In other words, when Hinduism meets other religions, other thought forms, other practices and ideas, Hinduism tends to be intrigued by those practices and ideas, and then to incorporate the best of them while remaining Hindu. So there's kind of an openness, an unboundedness to Hinduism, and a willingness to play with their tradition, and a willingness for their tradition to change as it encounters other traditions. I think, in my opinion, that's the greatest strength of Hinduism. So if you look at the evolution of Hinduism, I think what you see is a meeting of other religions and incorporating ideas from other religions, composition of new scriptures. You have the Vedas, and then you have the Puranas, and you have commentaries on the Vedas that become almost as authoritative as the Vedas themselves. And these developments strengthen tradition. They keep it relevant to its contemporary time period, and they've made it the vital living tradition that it is today, even as one of the world's oldest religions.
Anne-Marie?
Yeah. I would just add that there are heated arguments, of course, over truth, and people debated strongly throughout Indian history, different viewpoints, but there aren't revolutions to the same extent, the same type that you see in the Western religions, and there aren't heretics of the same type that you see in the Western religions. There are just disagreements, and then people go their own way, and time, whatever endures through time is trustworthy.
Well, let me ask about an ancient and a more modern example of what I guess we call maybe the absorption of other ideas from other religions. John Paul described it as an encompassing religion. Can either of you give me, say, something from the first 1,000 or so years of the religion and something, in the modern era of the last few hundred years that has changed has a specific influence from, say, the Muslims or the Christians, or even something non-religious from the setup of Indian society or other influences?
Well, one thing.
Anne-Marie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, but I'm going to start with the contemporary because that's what I've thought about more.
Okay.
This is controversial, but I think that fundamentalism is really a modern development of sorts. It claims to go back to the beginning, but I think it's a new way of approaching scriptures. And I think this is true both in the Western religions and in the Eastern religions. And somehow we've developed a literal reading, and it is immobile. It can't be changed. And if you look at the history of Hinduism, just for example, you will see it acts like an oral tradition even when it's not oral. It incorporates new insights. If you look at the Western biblical text, you will see that again and again, episodes are re-understood, reapplied to new contexts, even within the Bible. And then post-biblical times, to some extent, the same thing happens.
John Paul, do you have one from the earlier days of Hinduism?
Well, I think, I'll give you an example. There's a religion, you can call it Hinduism. Some Western scholars of Hinduism call it Vedism or Brahmanism. It's kind of some Westerns would say a pre-Hindu, highly ritualistic religion based on the Vedas. And out of that, there's a certain time period, about 2,500 years ago, where some of this ritualism itself, which was very magical in its practices, some people were disenchanted with it, and they were more interested in spirituality, more interested in ethics, more interested in how they experience life and using rituals to get certain outcomes within their life. And at this time period, there's a tremendous ferment in the South Indian continent. That's when Buddhism arose, for example, and that's when what some historians of Hinduism would call classical Hinduism arose, with its concepts of Brahman and Atman and rishis were going out into the forests and meditating and discovering truths, deep truths about the inner self and the universe, and really answering existential questions and metaphysical questions that human beings have. And that was a time of really dramatic change within Hinduism. But at the same time, Hinduism as a tradition, it tends to change, but not get rid of the past. It keeps the past. It just adds in and adds in and adds in. They're not trying to keep their religion neat and orderly so that somebody from the outside can study it and say, oh, this makes perfect sense. They want to play, to be creative, to be dynamic as a religion. So at this time, classical Hinduism arose. Buddhism also arose at that same time. And both of these expressions of human spirituality are very much with us today. People still study classical Hinduism in the form of the Upanishads and somewhat later the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, Buddhism is very much alive and well as a religion and very much growing in the West.
Dr. Chandra, let me just, in this segment, just asking you about your ideas about the sort of absorbing nature of Hinduism as you experienced it growing up as a Hindu.
Yes, I think I agree most of the thing what John Paul and Anne-Marie indicated. As the time progresses, new things come along, new ideas came along, and Hinduism embrace all the new ideas, and not only embrace, and they try to connect it with its old values. So they think old values are so broad enough they could include anything, which is either coming from Islam or coming from the Christianity or from any other religion. So it became pretty inclusive. As I indicated, even I go to church, I go to mosque, I still remain a Hindu. So that part, is very absorbing religion. And again, commenting on John Paul's, and I agree with him too. In fact, Hinduism is not the real name. This name was given by Europeans about 500, 600 years back.
Okay.
The real name of the religion or dharma was, as he said, Vedic or Sanatana. So when Europeans couldn't pronounce the name, and they gave the name Hinduism because there's a river in the northwest part of India. Name of the river is Sindh River.
Yeah.
Even they could not pronounce the Sindh, so they make it Indus River. And then people who live in Indus River, they were known as Indians, and the religion they followed, Hinduism. So the real name of the religion is the Vedic religion, which is the Sanskrit word from Veda, which if you translate in English, the religion of knowledge. Veda means knowledge.
Do you as a Hindu consider the term Hindu as sort of a slur? Do you prefer being called a Vedic believer?
I would prefer to be called as Vedic or Sanatana, but unfortunately that's not the case. People are labeled as Hindus, we became the Hindus.
Okay. I want to pick up on the historical relationship between the religion of Hinduism with other religions, specifically the two major religions that are also sort of in the Southeastern Asian area, and that would be Islam and Buddhism. I believe it was John Paul who may have brought up Buddhism first. John Paul, if you want to just tell me, is there any antagonism between Hinduism? I know Hindus and Pakistanis who practice Islam. There's always been tension there. But what is the Hindu idea of what other religions are? Are they a live and let live religion?
That is a very complicated question. There is Buddhism arose in India, and at a certain point in Indian history, Buddhism had almost completely disappeared from India. There was some, I would say, rivalry between what we call Hinduism and Buddhism, and basically, eventually, Buddhism left India and basically moved into East Asia and Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. So there was some rivalry there, but no violence, as Anne-Marie mentioned earlier. There was this interreligious rivalry was more intellectual than non-violent, basically. Today, most Buddhists in India, there's still very few, but most Buddhists in India are either Tibetan refugees or they are outcast or Dalit Hindus from the lowest caste of Hinduism who have converted from Hinduism to Buddhism to protest caste. And so there's some disgruntlement there amongst some Hindus that they have converted from Hinduism to Buddhism. But again, that does not usually rise to the level of violence at all.
We'll touch on the caste system in a bit here. Anne-Marie, what's your comment about the relationship of Hinduism with other religions?
Well, of course, picking up on the Hindu-Buddhist thing, Sri Lanka might appear to be the exception to the rule there, with the violence occurring there. I am not enough of a student of that conflict to know how much of it is religious or political, so I won't comment anymore, but that is a division there between Hindus and Buddhists that has been violent, but that's again modern, very modern period. And Islam has always been, well, when Islam came, it was as a conquering religion. But there wasn't a lot of violence, and many Hindus and many Muslims, I understand, became good neighbors, shared the continent very happily. There is, and I just read what I can read in English, and thank goodness many of the newspapers are in English that I can read from India. But I'm getting a slanted view, but I am concerned about the violent conflicts that I do read about between Hindus and Muslims in India now. I really don't know how extensive it is, because as is always the case with these interreligious conflicts, you only hear the disasters. You don't hear about the successes in living together peacefully. But that does seem to me to be much more prevalent in this period, and it seems to be global. We're going through some kind of a global jostling for power, and the religions are involved in that.
I'm sorry, Dr. Chandra, let me ask you about being raised as a Hindu. What were you taught about other religions? Were they thought of as apostates, or was it just like, well, they'll do what they do, we do what we do?
As you can see what India is predominantly Hindu. So when you are a majority religion, you don't think other way around. So of course, when I was growing up in this school, I had Muslim friends and Christian friends, and they were minority. But what they did, they did. As a Hindu, it did not bother me. And in fact, I come from a very small village in India. So even 90% of the population was Hindu, and we had 10% Islam, very few Christians, but we all were integrated pretty well. So religion was kept at home, but when we were in the school, outside, we were all one. So we did not have, the religion is the main issue for conflict. But I didn't feel any differently until I left India. When I came to US, there I was a majority religion, and here I'm a minority religion. Then you feel what the difference in religion means. So this is a kind of personal experience. So in India, we didn't care. They did their thing, Christians did their thing, and sometimes, we go to Christmas holidays, sometimes we'll go to Eid holidays, and they will come to our holidays. So, it was pretty well integrated. So religion was not a bigger factor than then. And as anybody mentioned, now I would say it's not conflict between religions, it's more political. The current conflicts which we see in India and elsewhere, it's more political than we have coexisted together in peace. Again, coming back to Sri Lanka, I think it's mostly political, not religious.
Well, let me pick up on the political thread, because one of the periods that I know that I've been interested in over the years in India was the Mughal dynasties, and they were sort of intellectual descendants of the Mongol Empire. And one of the things that the Mongols were pretty well known for was that they, despite their fierceness, they were pretty tolerant of religions. Were the Mughal dynasty, what was their take on Hinduism?
Oh, they really attempted to ruin Hinduism. So all the Hindu temples, Hindu gods, goddesses, and forced conversion. So
were they atheistic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Were they atheistic? I mean, were they against Hinduism, or were they just against religion on principle?
Islam.
Okay, Islam. Okay.
Yeah, they were part of post-conversion, and they were demolishing all the temples and holy places.
Okay.
And still, the place I come from, there was a holy Shiva temple there, and they abandoned the temple and built a mosque. So current political crisis in India for that Babri mosque. So they were very cruel Islam. I hate to use the word.
Go ahead, Anne Marie.
I think there's a confusion. The Mughal dynasty was not Mongol. It was.
Well, yeah, I know they considered themselves, though they took the Khanates and whatnot. I mean, that's why I'm distinguishing between the political and the religious. I know that they were not really Mongols, but things like the Chagatai Khanate and other things had influence, and the Mughals considered themselves, I mean, 20% of people, of people in Asia are blood relatives to Genghis Khan. That's what I'm just trying to draw out some threads.
To the best of my recollection, there wasn't much impact, if any, on India from the Mongol dynasty. I think that was further north and east. Yeah. But there certainly was the Mughal, Mughal dynasty, which was Muslim, Muslim rulers. So I'm a little bit confused by the question.
Well, but the Mongols, when they took over most of Asia and Central Asia, for example, there was the Chagatai Khanate, and these influenced Persia, which then further influenced into northern India. And I was just, because I know the term Mughal is a corruption of the word Mongol, and they had Khanates in northern India, and that's why I'm just saying, was the influence, because I know the Mughals ethnically are not Mongols, but they, just like Tamerlane claimed descent from Genghis Khan, even though he wasn't. There's always that kind of thing. That's why I was just asking. John Paul, what is your comment on that, the Mughals and their effect on Hinduism?
Okay, there is no simple answer to this question. If you look at the history of Islam in India and the history of Islam's relationships to Hinduism, it is enormously complicated. Islam entered India by a variety of means. There were Arab merchants trading all along the Malabar coast, and many people converted to Islam through that trade. There were mystical Muslim Sufi saints who would travel throughout India as missionaries and sing songs and recite poetry, and Indians love poetry. And many people converted to Islam under their influence. There were also invaders who came in and invaded. And some people were attracted to the simplicity and the clarity of Islam as a religion. And so there were also conversions then as well. But the Mughals and all the Muslims were a distinct minority, and they really could not have ruled successfully without the assistance of certain Hindus as well. So if you look in almost any court, Muslim court, anywhere from the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughal dynasty, you will find highly placed Hindu advisors within that court. So the situation is extremely complicated. You can find violent rivalry, you can find companionship, you can find religions get along with each other, religions fighting each other. You can find Muslims fighting for Hindus and Hindus fighting for Muslims against Hindus. It's immensely complicated once you get into the weeds.
Yeah, so just to pick up though on what you said, were the people that were, you said, serving these Islamic courts, were they considered now sort of historically considered quislings to the cause or to the nation?
They tend to be overlooked. Anybody who would call them a quisling would probably deny their existence, deny that there were even Hindus who were assisting the Muslims in their rule. They're not necessarily considered quisling. Some people accepted Muslim rule because it was reasonably effective for a while and maintained order and had reasonable levels of taxation, etc. But you can create a black and white, very clear reading of history if you want to. But if you actually study history and find out what really happened between the religions, between like 1200 and 1700, it's all immensely complex.
Well, let's talk about the caste system. I think you had mentioned it, John Paul.
Could I comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Chan.
I kind of disagree with what John Paul indicated. To some extent, it is true, but we could not say, broadly. As far as I have read in the history, there was only one Mughal emperor, Jalaluddin Akbar. He was the only one liberal Mughal emperor who respected the talent and the skills of whoever you are. It doesn't matter whether you are Muslim or Hindu or whoever you are. And during that time, Sufism came, and he was very welcoming Mughal emperor. So only during his time, it was a kind of respect for non-Muslims who were given. And before Akbar and even after Akbar, same thing, there were some people in the court of the Mughal emperors, but they were by force. If you do not join our cabinet, if you do not bring your daughter, do not bring your sister, I'm going to kill you. So they kind of yielded and accepted them as a supreme, and they did whatever they asked to do it. But I would say only one Mughal emperor, that was Akbar. He was very honorable to every challenge, everyone who is the best, and he respected them, and and included his advisors or his cabinet. Okay, now we could go to next.
Okay, well, I wanted to pick up what John Paul had said about the caste system, because here in the West, when we think of India or Hinduism, that's probably the first thing that comes up. Oh, they have a caste system. So if I don't, John Paul or Anne-Marie want to just briefly, what is the caste system for someone that doesn't know it, and what is its impact, or what is its place within the Hindu faith? Either one of you.
I can start it.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Chandra.
Well, in Hindu scripture, when you read the Vedas and Upanishads, there's no caste system. It's never mentioned about any caste system. It came post-Vedic era, and it was a division of the labor, and that's how it started. Like Brahmins, they were teachers, and the priests, and the Kshatriyas were warriors and kings, and the Vaishya, they were business communities, and Shudras, they were labor class. So this was a division of the labor, and since it's all Hindus living there, so the caste system was related to Hinduism. Even the Islam, in India, we have Islam, we have Christians. Even they talk about caste system in their own community. Because the reason is slightly different, because most of the Muslims in India, they are converted from Hinduism to Islam. And similarly, most of the Christians in India, they are converted from Hinduism to Christianity. So they go back to the caste they belong when they converted. So even you go to a Christian community and they say, "Oh, I'm a Brahmin Christian, and I'm a Kshatriya Christian." So unfortunately, it was in the continent, it was in India, but because the majority religion was Hindu, so it's related to Hinduism. So I think to a degree it's still there, but once India became independent, then it's unconstitutional. Caste system is unconstitutional, but the residual caste system is still in India.
John Paul, do you want to comment on the caste system and its historical place?
Caste is definitely a reality within India. The original Sanskrit term is not caste. That's a Portuguese term. The original Sanskrit term, and the term that you find in the Sanskrit scriptures is Varna. And it did, it's I'll have to disagree with Dr. Dravidi a little bit. There is an ontological origin, a metaphysical origin of the four different varnas. The Brahmins come from the mouth, the Kshatriyas or warriors come from the shoulders, the Vaishya come from the legs, and the Shudras from the feet. So,
and these body parts are what? The body of Vishnu or some holy deity?
Body of the cosmic man, Purusha, from whom all human beings come.
Okay.
So, that being said, I honestly think the West makes too much of the caste system. It is very much present, as Dr. Dravidi said, in both Islam and Christianity, in India as well. And I honestly think there's a sense where, I mean, as a Christian, I would say before you condemn the mote in your neighbor's eye, you should condemn the log in your own eye. And certainly in the West, we have our own class systems. People tend to marry and date and socialize within their own classes. And a lot of the caste system in India, although it is by birth and not necessarily, it's certainly highly analogous, similar to Western class systems as well. And I would also point out that the caste system, the traditional caste system in India, is under tremendous pressure from education, from capitalism, in which you really want an employee with the greatest capability, not necessarily from a certain jati subcaste, and from young people meeting in college and falling in love regardless of caste, and a rise, very slow rise, but a rise in love marriages rather than arranged marriages. So that traditional way of dividing up culture is under tremendous pressure by modernism right now.
Anne Marie, you look like you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yep. And of course, when the caste system was, the Varna system was, centuries back, and still stronger and more prevalent, we had the serf system, and we had class societies to a much greater extent than we do today, when we really value that upward mobility and the opportunity to do that. One thing I would say is there are, of course, negatives to this system, to the Varna system, as there are to all systems. And I do commiserate with the people who have ended up being outcasts, being at the very bottom of the system in their plight. But on the other hand, one of the pluses of this system was that you couldn't use your money from your business to buy political power or religious power. That wasn't yours to have. And likewise, if you were first caste and you were a priest or a scholar, it wasn't a way to becoming wealthy and having that additional monetary power or economic power over people, nor was it a way to have military power over people. There was a division in labor that also ended up to be a kind of impediment to the accumulation of all kinds of power. And that's neat.
I want to wrap up the interview with a segment talking about Hinduism in its current state now in the early 21st century, the prospects for the future of not only Hinduism but religion in an increasingly technological world. So let me start with you, Dr. Chandra. As someone who grew up with, as you said, priests of the religion, what is the sense now, do you think, about with devout believers in the Vedic faith, as you call it, and where it stands now and its prospects for the future?
It's again a loaded question, and it's difficult to answer, but I will give you my perspective. Since I live in the United States, where Hinduism is a minority religion, so the way I practice a religion, the way I see future of the religion will be much different than people who are in India, because in India it's a majority religion. So since I left India 45 years back. So I would give perspective what I have experienced and what I can think about my children and grandchildren. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think, as I indicated, I was born in a family of priests. And even I do not have any formal training in the religion, but I picked up from my family and from surrounding, and I'm providing service to the Hindi community. But during this 45 years of my stint in the United States, religion has changed quite a bit. And in my opinion, it has changed for better. Because I was living in rural India, understanding of the religion was minimal. Large number of the people could not read the Sanskrit. And I was privileged to born in the family, so we were able to read and understanding Sanskrit. So I have a little bit better understanding of the religion than people who do not know Sanskrit. Unfortunately, younger generation do not know Sanskrit. So this is the downside of the religion here, and I'm assuming it's in India too. When you do not understand the language, original language where the texts are written, so you start using your own interpretation. And when you use your interpretation, it has an influence of other religion in the society. So as I see, the way I practiced is not exactly same way my children are practicing. I have 2 children; they are all grown ups, and I have grandchildren. So I could see their practice of the religion has changed according to the society here. But basic principles remain the same. So what I see I think one thing we did not touch about the what uniqueness of Hinduism. I think Hinduism is the only religion where I can see we believe in reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
So even our gods are reincarnated, and especially we all know about the Vishnu, how many avatars had. So even my kids, my children, have adopted the concept of the religion in their own way. That the basic principle of reincarnation they believe in, and why reincarnation is so important, because I'm a scientist, so scientifically I cannot prove whether reincarnation is real or not. But my religion has told me reincarnation, and the concept of reincarnation has given me a reason to believe how we are reincarnated in our next body. Because according to Hindu principle, we have a soul, and our soul does not die. When we die, only our body dies. And that soul, depending upon the karma which we did, which I did in this life, will determine what will be my next life.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives me a motivation to be a good person. And the karma decides what I will be the next life. So most of us try to, like when we are in the school and college, we try to work hard and get grade A, higher grades. So I will move up. So similarly, if I take the principle of the karma and do the good karma, so my next life will be better life than what I have today.
Well, Dr. Chan, let me just ask you then, is a human being then considered the ultimate expression of the cosmos in Hinduism, i.e., 10,000 years ago, you started out as a dung beetle, and then you worked your way up to an aardvark, and then up to a monkey, and and now as Dr. Chandra, are you the king of the hill? Supposedly, are you heading towards the top?
Like I would mention Mahatma Gandhi.
Uh-huh.
I think Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul. So I'm assuming he must. But there is a liberation. You get a moksha. Mm-hmm. Once you are a superhuman being and did all good karma, you get the moksha. So you are not reincarnated. So, like in my opinion, Mahatma Gandhi may not be reincarnated as a human being because he was such a noble soul, and he must have liberated and got the moksha. So that's one concept. I'm trying to to be a good person, give me motivation, and believe in the reincarnation. That's one unique thing about our religion, which our kids really believe in. That if they do not believe in reincarnation, they will not care about the good karma.
Okay.
So good karma leads to the better life.
Well,
And yes.
Well, Dr. Chandra, I want to get to Anne-Marie and John Paul's, but I want to ask you one thing, one final point here for you to expound on, and that is, you had mentioned that you came from a poor town, and are most of the people who are Hindus, are they sort of just nominal Hindus? Here in America, we have mainline religious faith. But, there's a thing called sleeping in the pews. People who'd say, well, I'm a Roman Catholic or I'm a Baptist and whatnot. But really, they're just going through the motions and whatnot. Do most Hindus that you've known, do they just sort of go through the motions and say, yeah, I'm a Hindu,
No, it's your own interpretation. Like, being a Hindu, you don't have to go to temple on a regular basis. So even I could be a Hindu, just not going anywhere. I'm just practicing my religion. Practice of religion is very private. So it's not they are saying I'm a Hindu, but because they believe in that way of Hinduism. So that's I would say the beauty of Hinduism, how Hinduism survived in India with so many invaders. Because you could be a silent Hindu without making a big deal about it. So I consider it's the positive part of the religion. Yes, I would even now I would say large majority of the Hindus, they are silent Hindus. They don't care, but they practice at home, and when they go outside, they say, oh, "I'm Hindu," so that's all.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Let me turn to Anne-Marie and John Paul. Let me ask you about the current and future states of Hinduism. Is it a growing religion? Do you think that, like a lot of religions, it's going to be impacted pro or con by increasing technology? Anne-Marie, if you want to take that first.
Oh, I can't remember the statistics. I believe it is growing, not as quickly as Islam is growing, for example, but I believe it's growing at a slightly faster pace than the world population as a whole. But don't quote me on that one. Look at the Pew Research and you'll find out. PEW. When I think about the future, I'm concerned for all of our different religious groups, and I'm also hopeful for all of our different religious groups, depending upon the path that we take as individuals and as religions as a whole. I'm troubled, as I said, by the fact that we seem to be in conflict and that religion has become, and I understand why, that in a global world where everybody is connected to everybody else, and the threat seems to be that our individual personalities and our individual cultures and our individual ways of being are being erased. And it's going to all be a secular McDonald's world, and what made us unique and important individually will disappear. Religion is being used as a way to speak to to our core values and what makes us unique, and who we are as both individuals and as societies, as groups of people as a whole. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. But do we engage in conflict over that? Whose is the best? Which values are the best? Which religion is the best? Which one is true? Or do we cooperate and dialogue and find where we can move into a better future together? And I think there are many areas in which the religions are carrying traditions that are could be enormously helpful to us. And some people are already on these paths of ecological progress and peace as versus conflict between religions. And one of the things I think Hinduism brings to this in absolute glory is a way to have diversity and unity. And that's really, I think, what a lot of people are struggling with, and why we have religious conflicts is we haven't figured out a way to protect our diversity and our religious freedoms and our religious identities, and yet have unity. And the global technology makes that a very pressing issue.
Well, let me just before I get to John Paul, let me just follow up on what you had said. One of the secular critiques of all religion, not just Hinduism, but all religion, is that it erases individuality and it seeks to get people, to believe one way in one time and in one area, whether we're talking about here in America, abortion or other issues like gay rights or whatnot. So do you see that religion or Hinduism specifically is just another gathering, the way you might have people who are in a philosophical school or in a scientific pursuit like geology or whatnot? Do you see it in a broader sense than as something that's just a choke collar?
Yes, I think historically most religions have been ways of bringing vast numbers of people together, especially the large ones. And I think the small-scale religions have also found ways to live in peace historically. I think what you're talking about, the choke collar effect, is part of what we're seeing in the modern period as a result of modern pressures. If we're going to enter into a conflict, a war with other ways of being, other ways of living, right? Then we should all agree on what we want, and we should all stand together, and we should all have the same way of thinking. But this wasn't the pressing issue when all of Europe was Christian, and the questions were within Christianity. Then there was more of a diversity of opinions in many ways.
Okay.
Even within Christianity, that's certainly true, I think, within Hinduism.
Well, John Paul, let me end this conversation turning to you and your opinions on the current state of Hinduism and Hinduism going forth in this century, in this millennium, in an increasingly technological and probably more secular world that's coming.
I don't believe in secularization as people becoming less religious. I don't think that's something that is actually happening. I think if you look at the data, religions are changing, and the way that people practice religion and think about religion is changing. But as far as people becoming non-religious, there's really not very much data to support that. So my prognosis for Hinduism is that it is thriving and will continue to thrive, and mainly because it's an ancient religion that has not become attached to its ancient ways. It values its ancient ways, but also always adapts them to new circumstances. It remains open to new ideas and new practices. It adapts to technology. It uses technology. You can watch films about Hindu gods. You can watch, children can watch cartoons about Hindu gods that is using new technologies to continue and propagate the religion. And these are very, very popular in India today. So I don't think that Hinduism is going anywhere. It's going to be around and healthy 1,000 years from now, maybe 2,000 years from now. I think the greatest danger for any religion today is becoming excessively attached to the past and trying to resist change, or trying to say this is who we are and you don't want any external influences, because then the religion itself becomes rigid and maladaptive and inflexible, and it's that type of religion that tends to disappear into the past. But open, inquisitive religions that adapt to change and look forward to the future, they tend to do very well. And Hinduism, most of Hinduism is very much that religion.
Let me just give you all a final saying, if anything I've missed before I end the show. So Dr. Chandra, do you have anything that you want to say about Hinduism that I haven't brought up?
No, most of the things we covered, as I mentioned about the karma. So two major teachings of the Hinduism, the upasana and karma. Upasana is devotion and dedication, and the karma is the good deeds that will give you a better next life.
Okay. Anne-Marie, anything that you want to add as a final note?
No, on to John Paul. Maybe I'll think of something. But
Okay, John Paul, do you have any final thing you want to add?
I just like to touch on what I just said and clarify a little bit. I think we talked earlier about when religions meet, And when religions meet, they can kind of be open to each other and kind of change, but they actually don't become homogenous. It's not like you get two colors and they bleed together and become the same color. They actually become just different religions in different ways, but they have their own identity. They're just transformed by their relationship. I really think Hinduism is one of the religions that has been best at this throughout world history. And actually, what I'm doing right now as a practicing Christian is trying to be more like that, and trying to be someone who learns and is transformed by the encounter with other religions. I have stayed Christian throughout those studies, not as an act of will, but as an act of attraction to Jesus Christ. But I've definitely been transformed at the same time by my encounter with Hinduism, and specifically Ramanujan, the Sri Vaishnava tradition. So I celebrate openness, I celebrate pluralism, the ability of many different religions and groups of people to live together and to get along and to profit from their differences. And I honestly think that the world can look to India as a very traditionally pluralistic culture that has navigated pluralism successfully most of the time and has lessons to offer the rest of the world on how to get along and how to profit from each other's differences rather than fearing difference.
Well, I'll link to all three of your university websites so anyone can contact you if they're interested. I want to thank all three.
Anne Marie would like to make a final contribution.
Oh, you got it? Oh, go ahead, Anne Marie.
Yeah, well, got me going. I do think that's true historically of India, and it was one of my hopes for the future. A precise example of how globalization and our modern context is making even this very pluralistic, open society struggle to maintain that is the situation with Muslims who do eat beef and Hindus who do not. And where do you draw the lines when you're in a modern society, in a modern political situation, as to what can be done in a predominantly Hindu context? Is it too terribly offensive for Muslims to bring cattle in specifically for slaughter, for example, or to run them for slaughter? India has been playing in some places with rules about what can and can not be done with cattle. And that's not surprising, since cows play such an important role as a sacred animal. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we all of our religious traditions need to be rooted in the past, but open to a different future. And the future is not going to look exactly like the past, but it can be faithful to the past and to the things that were the best in the past. And we can bring those things forward, but we can only do it in trust and work with each other, because it's not clear from anybody's scriptures what the answer to that question should be. Those questions should be.
Well, thank you, Anne Marie. Thank you, John Paul, and thank you, Dr. Chandra.